Chapter 10 of Sinister House by Leland Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 10. By the time we were back in the gloomy house behind the hemlocks, it was 7 o'clock. Annette at once told Giles that if he meant to stay and watch, he had better make a fire in the living room. And without stopping to think how difficult it might be for him to help himself thus, we groped our way upstairs and into Julia's room. Julia was lonesome and very weak, but all was not abandoned in that house. The old servant downstairs in the kitchen was making a hot soup for Julia's supper, and Annette dispatched me to fetch it. Upon returning with it to the chamber, I found that Annette had lighted a lamp by the bed, had smoothed out the pillows, and was talking quietly with her patient. The room was cold, of course, and still far from being cheerful, for the bright lamp was heavily shaded and the gas flickered in the draughts. I had no sooner given the soup over to my wife than Julia asked for news of Eric, and I must tell her that I had yet to find him. At that she tried to get out of bed, but Annette restrained her.
"But you will find him, Pierre," she begged me. "He must not be left alone. I am not sick, that is, only my body, his mind, his spirit. He will not tell me. I cannot help him because... Oh, you know why, Pierre. But you...
He cannot help you, Julia." All she said was, "Together." She wasn't rambling, but she was terribly excited. I tried to convince her that it would be dangerous to her to bring him back to the house. She understood, but she had a secret faith of some sort in Eric's being able to save her, even though his mere presence in her room that night might deliver her to death at the hands of his familiars. She was of two minds. I promised to find Eric, but I did not promise to bring him back to the house, and I am not sure that she exacted that definitely out of me. Annette followed me out into the hall and whispered to me to stop in the kitchen for something to eat, whether I felt hungry or not.
"Make Giles eat something, too," she added.
When I was halfway downstairs, she leaned over from above to ask me where I should take Eric if I found him. "To the Caraway Club," I whispered back. She had since told me that she felt better to know that I should not bring him back to the house. She both believed and did not believe.
"If you don't find him, come back here, sure,"
she said as she turned into the chamber. On my way to the kitchen, I glanced into the living room for Giles. There was no warmth or charm in the place. He had lit the gas and was sitting before the grate in which a miserable, lightless fire was smoldering. We couldn't eat much, but we found some wine in the kitchen and each drank a glassful. To tell the truth, I was glad to get away from my wife's cousin. He was depressed and sullen, as well he might be. I don't know what it was kept him in the house, unless he shared with the rest of us the feeling that something unusual was going to happen there that night. I hunted high and low for Eric. In the Ford, I went mile after mile along every road I thought he could have taken, and farther than I thought he could have progressed. I even went to the village of Stanton, but there I found the village store and the post office closed for the night, and the crossroads were deserted. I went to the Caraway Club, all dark and deserted. The caretaker looked at me as if I were Satan blowing in on the wind. He had not seen Eric. I told him I might be back later and not to keep me waiting too long outside in the cold. Again and again I stopped the car and called as loudly as I could across the fields that lay invisible in the darkness, lonely and windswept on either side of the road. I left the car and felt my way through paths along the edge of the cliffs, even down by the riverbed, falling and hurting myself more than once. It was all of no avail. Near midnight I returned to the house, chilled to the bone, disheartened, and gloomy in my mind. I both hoped and feared to find Eric there. But he had not returned. Giles was still before the cold, smoldering fire in the living room, to which the gaslight gave no look of charm. Nothing, Giles told me, had happened in the house. Annette had not come downstairs. No sound came from above. The silence in the desolate room was depressing. I heard only the rattle of a dead branch against one of the windows now and then, the steady roar of the high wind in the chimney and about the house, and the continuous banging of that loosened and forgotten shutter.
"That thing," said Giles, "will drive me mad."
I made a move to go out on the veranda.
"No use, Pierre. I've been out there. You can't reach it from outside. Got to get at it from inside, through the Bluebeard room."
He groaned. "Ah, Giles," I whispered, "you too begin to feel something in this house."
"I feel death and desolation about it," he muttered. I'm damn cold and I can't make this fire burn."
I made no move to help him. Let the cold and the bleakness get in their work on him. For my part, though, I had yelled myself hoarse over all the countryside, and had returned forlorn and tired. I felt the house was harmless. Warily I sat on the sofa where the night before I had sat motionless with fear. Under the rose-colored hanging in the hallway, yellowish and faded in the dingy gaslight that fell on it from the living room, I saw drafts of air pass like waves. I heard the roaring of the wind and the banging of that inaccessible shutter. I shivered with bodily cold. But I knew there was nothing in the house at present to fear. The very desolation made me feel safe. Somewhere a clock struck 1. Still, there was no sound from upstairs.
"Are we going to sit like this all night?"
Giles grumbled. "Why don't you stretch out on this sofa and try to sleep?"
"I can't sleep with that shutter banging."
"Cover your head with sofa pillows." He made no reply. The slow minutes dragged on.
"I would to heaven I had some whiskey,"
he said after a while. "No use to hunt for it in this house." I had been surprised enough to find even wine. Eric never drank, never smoked, never swore. Queer, queer. Not like the rest of us. I fell to thinking about him. I concluded he was something of an ascetic, made human and vulnerable by the one great love in his life. Yet I had to grant that I felt in him a great tenderness towards everything. Ardent, visionary, too. Some thing, someone, had checked him, done him deep in all but mortal harm. Julia could heal, but she... I turned up my coat collar and shoved my stiff hands deeper into my pockets. Julia must be sleeping. What should I say to her if she woke and asked for her husband? How could I reassure her? Where was he? Had he fallen in the darkness and twisted his leg? The sound of the wind began to irritate me, and the banging of the shutter got on my nerves as it got on Giles's. What did Julia fear in that room, that she would not have it opened? In those dreary minutes, if ever my imagination, were it too wild, would have evoked evil and unearthly things, might have pictured before me the dark, gruesome interior of that room, perhaps a suicide hanging from the ceiling, vague in the darkness, yet visibly swaying on the cord. It was never my imagination that found evil in the house. Tonight, there was not the faintest thrill in that new nerve of mine. The house was not as it had been. The evil was gone from it. The gentle, sensitive master was lost in the night, and had left his dwelling bleak, lonely, but safe. If only the wind would rest for a while and that nerve-wracking banging cease. I jumped up and began pacing the floor. Giles poked at the fire. A longing to speak with my wife grew stronger and stronger in me. If I could talk only 5 minutes with Annette, the remainder of the night would pass more cheerfully. Had she heard me return in the car and had not called me? No, I had tried to make no noise. Maybe she was anxious about me. I started myself thinking that perhaps Eric's familiars had come back without him and had done mischief upstairs. No sound from up there for hours. Not a step on the floor, not the creak of a door's opening, not the murmur of a voice. Maybe Annette was cold. I stood this as long as I could, and then I took off my boots and stole up the stairs. It was dark and drafty in the upper hallway. I went on tiptoe to the door of the room in which I knew Julia lay, and listened for some sound. Nothing. I started to go down again, but I couldn't.
"Annette," I whispered. "Annette."
I listened again. No response. Slowly and without a sound, I opened the door and looked into the chamber. In a big chair by the side of the bed, away from the door, sat my wife, bundled in her heavy coat. The bright light from the lamp streamed over her hands, which lay upturned upon the knitting in her lap. Her head had fallen back against the top of the chair, in shadow. She was fast asleep. Julia lay fast asleep in the bed, turned on her side away from Annette, her cheek resting on both her hands. I could hardly see their breathing. There was little movement in the room, the fluttering of the gas flame, the curtains blowing in from the window, which was open not more than an inch, the ruffling now and then of the triangular bit of sheet that hung over the edge of the bed. That was all. It was no use to wake them. I closed the door as quietly as I could, but as I did so I had the feeling that I was closing it upon a scene set for a drama, ready and waiting, but not to be disturbed until the acting should begin. And just then For the first time in that long night, my nerve of horror shuddered within me. I was all but overcome with forebodings. I thought I heard a moan from the room of sleep on which I had closed the door. I paused. I thought I heard a new, strange sound. It was the beating of my own heart. As I stole downstairs again, like a murderer for stealth, the clock struck 2. When I took my place again on the sofa, I felt the house was no longer safe. The banging of the shutter terrified me. I hid my face in my hands. Instantly, I thought a voice rang shatteringly loud in my ears, crying, "We will kill her tonight!" I sprang to my feet. In the doorway stood Eric. He looked as if something in the night had wrung the blood out of him. His hair was wild about his pale face. His clothes were all deranged and in some places torn. My first thought was to throw him out of the house. His own house. The murderous cry I had heard told me that his familiars had come back with him. I had no doubt they were already above in the chamber of restful sleep. They had yelled out on their way up the stairs, but as I looked at Eric, a mild gentleness in his face cast a spell over me and restrained me. He began to speak strange words in an extraordinarily subdued voice. "I have been walking in the wind. Out of the whirlwind a voice spake unto me, saying, The law of man cannot lay a finger upon thee, nor hast thou sinned against the law of God. Inasmuch as thou wast patient in his sight, so will he care for thee. Yet though thou carriest thy burden to a secret part of the earth, and there bury it, it shall not be forgotten." Giles and I looked at him in silence. You can hardly imagine the effect of his words and his manner upon us. While he went on talking like a prophet from an ancient time, I caught no sense in his words, which veiled rather than made clear something about his responsibilities under the just laws of heaven, and about his wife Julia, who, as a human companion, remained more dear to him than the purest bliss and sanctimony he could dream of. And he talked as if this style of expression were the most familiar and the most natural to him. At last he must have read our bewilderment and our discomfiture in our eyes, which remained fastened upon his face. He broke off his rapt discourse, and stepping quietly into the room, begged us to excuse his diffuseness and ask us if we had been sleeping. I could not but wonder if the night had changed him into a mild idiot. "Damnation! Sleeping!" cried the matter-of-fact Giles. "In this desolate house! Listen, that shutter's been banging without let-up. How can a man sleep in such a racket?" Eric recognized the sound and looked at me. "Can you not fasten it, Pierre?" "No, Eric," I answered, walking out of the spell his words had cast over me, and eyeing him curiously. "We cannot reach it from the outside." "Never mind the damned thing," Giles growled. "Indeed, gentlemen," replied Eric, "I would not have you disturbed thus. I regret that you have not been able to sleep, watching the house in my absence, too, but I think we can fasten it," he went on, "from the inside." Quietly, he fingered over the keys on a ring he had taken from his pocket. While he was doing so, I heard the dull sound of footfalls on the floor above my head. The planks creaked. My heart grew faint within me. But Eric went on quietly. "This key," selecting a bright Yale key that glistened even under the dingy gaslight, "I found by chance today. It will, I feel sure, open the door for you, gentlemen. You know what door. I might say the door to your repose." The whole house seemed to me full of secret horrors. I heard the sound of voices above me. Terror invaded me, and I took a step forward. Eric, misinterpreting my action, said courteously, "No, not you, nor I either, for, as you know, I promised my wife Julia that while she is in the house, she is still here, is she not? But you, Mr. Farrow." He walked over to Giles and gave him the keys. "You," he went on kindly and without a trace of emotion, "who are pleased to stir up the dead. This night they will come to you. Take the key. Do not be afraid. Let us go together and fasten the shutter. Then you will sleep soundly, and perhaps for a long time. I would I could sleep." A blast of wind swept through the room and nearly tore the straining, whistling blue gas flame from the burner. Very distinctly, I heard a moan from upstairs. Giles got up and accepted the key. "Upon my word," he said, "sleep or no sleep, we can have a look at that room." We all heard at that moment the sound of hysterical weeping. "That," said Eric simply, "is my wife Julia. She cannot sleep at night when I am in the house." "She needs you, Eric," I cried out. He looked at me in mild surprise. "Oh, no," he answered gently. "Not me. Come, Mr. Farrow. We shall need a light. There is a lamp in the dining room. Come." They went away together. I had been perhaps 3 or 4 minutes alone, somehow unable to move, when I heard the rapid stamping of a foot on the floor of the room above me. I rushed to the stairway. Just as I reached the top, Annette flung open the door of Julia's chamber and ran out into the hall, crying loudly, "Help, Pierre! Come quick!" Together we pushed back into the room where the scene had been made ready. The acting had begun. Julia lay rigid on the bed, her head bent back as if a heavy hand were at her throat. With her arms, she kept up a weak movement, as if she were trying to repel something from before her face. Her gasping for breath was frightful to hear. Annette went to one side of the bed, I to the other. I could see that Julia's eyes were half opened, but they were glazed. Annette tried to lift her in hopes that would ease her struggle for breath, but it did no good. We were powerless to help or relieve. "Go for the doctor, quick!" Annette called to me in anguish. As I started to go, Julia began trying to speak. I leaned over her and put my head close to her lips. I felt awful things crawling on my face like the feet of giant moths. "What is it, Julia?" I sobbed. She made a sound as of words, but I could not catch her meaning. "She is trying to say something about a room," Annette whispered. "She has been trying to say it for a long time. Oh, dear, what does the poor child mean? Go for the doctor, Pierre. Go for the doctor. She is dying. She cannot live like this." Again I started, but Julia wrestled in Annette's arms, and my wife called to me, fearing she could not hold her. Suddenly I guessed what Julia might mean by the room. I ran for the stairs. Halfway down, something caught me from behind around the neck and under the chin, so that I lost my balance and fell forward to the lower floor. Hardly conscious of the sharp pain in my head and in my elbow, I struggled to my feet against something beating the air about me, staggered on along the corridor, and gained the dining room. The door to the forbidden room was open. I went in. In the harsh light of the unshaded lamp Eric held, I saw vaguely that it was a large room, the largest in the house, and that the walls were paneled in wood. Eric was standing by the fireplace. Giles was kneeling by the wall, fingering something in one of the panels. Waving my arms round my head to keep off the things that were bent upon strangling me, I made my way towards the 2 men. I tried to call out to them, but my voice was stifled in my throat. Giles, still unconscious of my approach, said triumphantly, "Ah, there it is." And just as I came up behind Eric, a long panel in the wall swung open like a door. We 3 men stood facing the full-size portrait of a woman. It was physically repulsive, morally odious. I looked at little but the face, the lidless, flat eyes, the cruel yet simpering malice. I recognized them. For a couple of seconds we stood without moving. Then Eric swung the lamp high above his shoulder and hurled it at the canvas. The chimney crashed. There was a spurt of brownish-yellow flame, and as the instant darkness settled, a piercing scream behind us and the dull sound of a body fallen to the floor. My eyes were at first blind in the sudden gloom, but I smelt the oily smoke of the extinguished lamp, and I heard, even above the roar of the wind, Eric's loud and rapid breathing, like the panting of a dog. In a moment or two I felt him brush by me, and as I began to see again, I made him out, kneeling beside a white figure on the floor, vague and hardly distinguishable. I knew it was Julia. He picked her up in his arms and carried her towards the dining room door. I followed them as closely as I could, anxious and full of fear, for Julia was moaning, and I knew that the as yet invisible powers of malice had left me, to fasten themselves once more on her. Eric carried her along the hallway and started up the stairs. Annette, who had run down into the lower hallway, went up backwards ahead of him, trying to pull him forward, while I followed just below him and supporting him when, in the face of those malignant fiends that were opposing him, he all but fell back. I never knew whether he felt or saw them. He may have thought that Julia was struggling in his arms only in a delirium. He swayed from side to side, leaning now against the wall, now against the frail banister, which bent out perilously under his weight and threatened to give way. Sometimes he had to fight half a minute to gain a step. though Annette was pulling him forward and I was bracing him from behind. Never have I been witness of such a struggle. The invisible odds were all but too much for us. It was like a man striving to swim against a powerful current, and how Eric, not a physically strong man, progressed against it, I cannot say. At the top of the stairs he reeled and nearly fell, but Annette clutched him and managed to drag him into the chamber. He laid Julia down on the bed. She, poor victim, was almost exhausted. She put her hands weakly to her throat and her moans grew more feeble. A bright shaft of light from the lamp fell across the sheet over her breast. The gas flame flickered in the draught. I stood close beside Eric, looking down at her, while Annette, having found and folded a piece of paper, was fanning her. As if that would make her breathing easier. They were doing their utmost to strangle her. As yet I had not seen them, but I had felt their hands. I knew they were at their devilish work. Julia's weaker and weaker movements were too eloquent for me to be in doubt. But she was losing strength. At last she lay motionless in her bed. And then I thought I saw something. A spectral hand at her slender throat, a faint point of light crossing and recrossing her breast as swiftly as a spider weaves about its prey. Eric said in a cold, strained voice, "She is dying." And he threw himself on his knees beside the bed. "No, Eric, God help you. She is being murdered by the evil that haunts you," I whispered, bending to his ear. Julia lay so still I thought she was already gone, but no. At the doorway of death she turned, opened her eyes, and looked at her husband. She whispered, her lips hardly moving, "I have loved you. I trust you, but—" The two fiends became incandescent. I saw them try to throw themselves upon her. They got in each other's way, but Julia, with the last strength she had, swept them aside with her arm, sat up in bed, and cried out in a loud voice, "Eric, tell me, who are they? You and I together, we shall defeat them." Her strength was then exhausted, and she fell over against him. He clasped her head to his breast as if he would save her merely by enfolding her in his arms. But I saw the malignant two lope round the head of the bed and try to tear her from him. Could he see them? I do not know, though he raised his head as if to face them. I think his eyes were sightless. "Hulda Snart," he said, and his voice was full of the bitterest hatred. "You will burn in hell for this at last." A terrible burst of wind ripped out the gas, and in the darkened room the shapes of Hulda and Morgan Snart glowed cold like phosphorus. They desisted from their murderous work, cowed by his voice. They stood above him as he knelt by the bed with Julia in his arms, balked, on the verge of retreat, motionless save for the flickering of their outlines. The cold that touched me from them was like the cold of ether on the skin. I heard Julia's faint voice. "Who was that evil woman?" Eric took a deep breath, held it an instant, then, still with his face upturned and his eyes like those of blind persons that look towards what they do not see, he said, "She was my wife." They stepped back from him. "I know your wickedness, Hulda Snart. You know my crime. I will lay both for judgment before my wife Julia." He half rose from his knees, lifting Julia with him, and shouted, "Get out of this cursed house!" I know now that since a certain hour in the past Eric had never feared them living. He did not fear them dead. But for an awful minute, I held my breath. But they went away. As if caught in a whirlwind, the door slammed behind them. I heard a hideous, shrill whistle in the hallway. I heard the crash of broken glass downstairs. A shriek of hatred died away in the night. Outside, the wind made only a low moan. The house and the room were silent. A clock struck 3. End of chapter 10.